So Space Marines have got a whole load of cheaper units and free war gear, but perhaps few of them are quite as terrifying as the mighty Plasma Inceptors, a fast-moving damage leaf blower, perhaps coming soon to a tabletop near you. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd take a focused look at one of the scariest new Space Marine datasheets on the block, and talk about the sheer threat and tactics that Inceptors can bring to the table. Now their plasma weapons went down from big 60-point expensive models to the far more expendable but very dangerous 40-point ones. Let's take a look at their datasheet, damage output, the chance of overcharging, and then a bit about fielding them in-game. Inceptors, of course, are the Gravis armour that flies, great big chunky space marines with enormous jump packs and grav plates on their feet, and dual wielding some rather hefty firepower, some assault bolters or plasma exterminators. The kit's £32.50, €42 or $55 from Games Workshop directly. Not amazing on the points per dollar front now they went down so much, but there are worse things than 40k. As kits go, I think they're alright. I feel like they maybe do look just a little bit on the ungainly side with the grav plates, though certainly the sight of a Space Marine hurtling out of the air, dual-wielding massive guns really is quite fun. In the kit you get the choice of the guns and a couple of different head plates. You've either got the standard heads that you can see here, or a bit more of a blast shield affair with a vision slit. The one thing I would say about the kit though is that I find the flight stands on the back kind of horrific. I magnetised the top of those so you can take them on and off. I have seen a lot of people who've glued them and then they've snapped. If you were thinking about picking any of them up, Element Games in the UK has them a bit cheaper than most, 15% off at £27.63. I'll leave a link to that in the video description below. The link does help support the channel. I would bear in mind though that rules advantages could be kind of temporary, particularly if 10th edition is coming out in summer. Moving on to their scary rules though, and Inceptors come in squads of 3 to 6. They're 40 points per model regardless of war gear now. Chunky Gravis armoured flying space marines that move 10 inches. They've got toughness 5, 3 wounds, 2 attacks, and they're either armed with 2 assault bolters or 2 plasma exterminators. The assault bolters are assault 3, 18-inch range, strength 5, AP-1, and damage 1. The plasma exterminators are D3 shots at strength 7, AP-3, damage 1, and blast, though you can overcharge them like most plasma to strength 8 and damage 2, though if you roll a 1 to hit with any of those shots, then the bearer is slain. It does mean that overcharging them is kind of ludicrously dangerous, as we'll see the chances of in just a second. The 4 plasma shots for 40 points really isn't too bad, particularly when they're coming on quite a mobile platform. Finally, keywords wise, they are core infantry, so can unlock most buffs in the codex. They are primaris, so get transhuman physiology, a Mark 10 Gravis, so that does give them some other options, and they can deep strike with death from above if they need to. So the terrifying thing about these guys at the moment is their damage output. Here's just a comparison of the assault bolters to the plasma exterminators. Previously I probably would have said the assault bolters was perhaps slightly the way to go when they cost 20 points less, but now the plasma is equal, it pretty much beats out the assault bolter on every single category, sometimes by pretty major amounts. They'll be fairly even on infantry with bad saves, but presuming no tactical doctrine, the plasma actually beats out the bolters even against guardsmen, as they would get a slight save against the bolters, and usually the plasma's going to be triggering the blast keyword if you're firing at, say, a guard infantry squad. Getting the flat 3 shots from blast is really quite nice if the enemy's got 6 or more models in the unit, and they're going to be massively more effective against them. Otherwise, if you are prepared to overcharge and risk the Inceptors, then you kill on average 6 Space Marines. That goes all the way up to an average of 9 Space Marines if there's more than 5 models in the unit and you get the big 18 shots. You kill around about 2.2 Terminators on average, going up to 3 and a bit if there's more than 5 of them, 9 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle, but they do fall down a bit against hard targets like toughness 8. Say a toughness 8 unit with a 5+ invul save and -1 damage only means that you get 2.6 wounds against them, probably not worth overcharging. In general, the bolters do okay against the guardsmen, and interestingly enough against the very tough target, but besides that they're kind of monumentally behind the plasma inceptors. Even in chapters like Imperial Fist, I would still take plasma at this point. Of course, plasma does come with a big drawback, being able to blow up your own model right out of the air, and I would bear in mind that you really want to roll these individually, not as a big unit altogether, otherwise there's a pretty high chance that you just lose the entire unit straight out. By rolling them individually, you've got more chance that any ones that you do roll will all be on one model, and so will be made redundant. Still though, even rolling them individually, if you get an average of 4 shots, gives you around about a 52% chance to kill an Inceptor. It means that basically each time you overcharge them, you've got a good chance of removing 20 points of your own models from the board, 60 points out of a squad of 120 on average. It's definitely not great, but against the right target, you might well be wiping out as much of the squad cost in a single volley, particularly if you're targeting things like Space Marines with more than 5 models in the unit. And in particular, if you're playing the Inceptors as a bit of a trade-out unit, you might just jump them forward, and you may as well overcharge them, as they're not going to be all that hardy to enemy return fire. If the enemy's firepower is going to be a bit stretched, and every Space Marine alive counts, maybe it does matter a bit more. But if, say, they're going to be the only unit that's exposed next turn, and they're almost certainly going to die, it doesn't really matter too much if you do overcharge and lose 1 or 2 more. In general though, if you possibly can get reroll 1s to hit on Inceptors, then that drops to an 11% chance to lose 1 each time you overcharge, far more acceptable. Each overcharged Inceptor on average gets you around about 4 or 5 points worth of casualties to your own sides, which is pretty big compared with 20. It means that with Inceptors, having a captain on standby is just going to give you some monumental benefits, mainly just the preventing lost models, but the extra damage output certainly doesn't hurt either. So just in general for buffs and synergies, as well as things like, I probably would say a captain has got to be high up the priority list if you do want to buy stuff in for them. Maybe a jump captain so he can actually keep up with them, though maybe a bike captain could work for the speed as well, or even perhaps a Terminator one to deep strike alongside them if that's the plan. There's a few abilities that allow you a plus 3 inch to your aura abilities as well, scattered throughout the various marine codexes, such as the Vox Spiritum for Primaris characters, that could be useful enough too. Otherwise, for support options, the Tactical Doctrine certainly wouldn't hurt. An extra AP-1 to AP-4 is going to be relevant against some targets, though perhaps a little bit less now Armour of Contempt isn't a thing. For potential other characters, that might vary a bit depending on the army. You could get Librarians for a 5+ invul save, which is a bit more relevant now. There are other options like, say, the Deathwatch Dominus Aegis Shield. There's many other sources of rerolls out there, Lieutenants or Chapter Masters. Chaplain shooting buffs like +1 to wound the closest unit could be nice, and on big threatening models that might well hurt themselves, fast apothecary variants aren't terrible either, like the Dark Angels or the Blood Angels ones. Speaking of chapters, I feel like at least the vast majority of them can offer the Inceptors at least something. Perhaps if I had to pick some top chapters to run them in though, then these might be them. I think White Scars are particularly relevant with them for the advance and shoot for no penalty. It means they've got a very big threat range, potentially 16 inches movement, then 18 inches shooting, and they could even charge after that if it made sense to. The Dark Angels of course have their weapons from the Dark Age for 2 CP, a big unit of Plasma Inceptors with damage 3 Plasma is going to put the smack down on just about anything in the game. Terminator squads would absolutely hate that sort of thing if they're going to be hit by, say, 18 Plasma Inceptor shots, potentially with rerolls. Finally, for the top chapters, I think the Ultramarines are particularly interesting. They get to fall back and shoot, which is relevant seeing as fly units can't since 9th edition. Always handy for a unit that's going to be getting at least somewhat close. And they also have a reroll 1s to hit stratagem as well. If you've got an outlying unit that's nowhere near a captain, that would allow you to overcharge with a lot more certainty. Otherwise though, I feel like basically most of the rest are fine. Iron Hands are very scary in general at the moment and could add a bit more survivability. Black Templars could make them a bit tougher as well with a 5+ invul vow, or maybe even Relic Bearers if you're feeling generous. Blood Angels I think are interesting enough, a +1 to hit stratagem when they fall out of Deep Strike, a better charge if they want to charge from Deep Strike, better melee when they get there, and the ability to jump out of combat if they happen to get locked up to come down blazing next turn again. Space Wolves have got an ignores modifier stratagem that could be handy for advancing them, plus you could have Rune Priests jumping up the board to support them with cover perhaps, and Deathwatch have that Dominus Aegis relic, plus can get objectives secured out of their kill teams and all manner of rerolls. In general though, I'd consider the Tactical Doctrine nice but not massively necessary. AP-3 is plenty. A captain I think is generally going to be wanted if you're fielding a whole ton of Inceptors, and I feel like they're just generically strong enough to be usable by any chapter, but some of them look like they're truly standout. Otherwise, in the core book there's a fair few stratagems that are usable on them. Unyielding in the face of the foe can give you a +1 to save against damage 1 weapons, definitely useful enough now Armour of Contempt is gone. Transhuman Physiology will make them tougher, only wounded on a 4+. Hammer of Wrath could give you some mortal wound impact hits, though I think it's quite low yield. Uncompromising Fire could allow you to shoot and do an action, not too bad for a unit that's going to be dropping onto the board, could allow you to do retrieve data if you wanted to go for that. And of course, Auspex Scan is pretty brutal if the opponent manages to set up a unit too close to these, they could just literally be hoovered straight off the board with plasma. Overall, with decent speed and this much general purpose damage, I do feel like the Inceptors are going to be a very threatening unit going forward, and I feel like they'll be a fairly interesting and punchy unit to use in game. They do have quite a lot of options going for them as to how you choose to use them. First up, you could think about deep striking or starting them on the board. I feel in general most 40k armies typically want to start most things on the board if you can hide them. They should hopefully be able to remain safe and then jump forwards to blast folks with plasma. Still though, dropping down turn 2 should almost certainly guarantee them line of sight on something good with the 18-inch range. It might depend on the army that you're facing a little bit though. In terms of numbers to field them, I'd be very tempted by either 3s, 5s or 6s. Units of 3 would be quite nice for trading out, jumping forward, blasting a lot of damage output, and then likely getting removed in return without sacrificing too much of your army. Big units of 5 and 6 will be better for buffs if you have any single unit character buffs going for them. I feel like you could argue for either 5 or 6. 5 because you don't have to care quite so much about coherency, plus a bit more protection against enemy blast weapons, or 6 because you've got the option to combat squad then if you want to. For support, I think in general, if you're wanting to run a decent number of them, they seem like the ideal unit to have clustered around a captain. Probably a jump captain with some sort of melee threat to be a bit of a countercharge if the enemy tries to get in close and personal with them. I could easily see a jump captain bounding up the board with them and hoovering up a vast amount of damage to anything exposed. In game, pretty much their ideal target is any elite infantry, and particularly units with over 5 models in them. They're just going to be absolutely crazy damage output against them. Enemy Space Marines are ideal. Then each turn there's really quite a lot of options that you can choose with them. You can think about how many units of them you're jumping out from behind terrain to strike at the enemy. You can think about whether or not you're just moving a normal 10-inch move or advancing to get better lines of sight or get onto objectives and things. You would sacrifice some damage, but it's not that bad. Ideally, when they're jumping up the board, they might be a good choice for trying to get into cover. They could think about castling around a captain and then all jumping out together to really hit the enemy hard, or disperse and play a bit more of a individual unit trading game. Each turn they actually fire, you can choose whether or not to overcharge. Sometimes it's really not going to matter all that much. Sometimes it could well be worth it, even if you're taking big casualties. I guess it depends on just how badly you need that enemy unit dead versus the risk of losing your own models. Then after they have fired, you can always think about charging. Often it's not going to be the most amazing idea, as you don't usually want them locked in combat, but they easily have enough attacks to bully light infantry, particularly say if you're an assault chapter in the assault doctrine. Blood Angels with a +1 to wounds and extra attacks are going to be great. Broadly speaking, I'd say their biggest weaknesses are perhaps getting locked up, the fact that they're not really all that tough to kill without Armour of Contempt now. Anything damage 3 is going to go through them very, very quickly, and while their damage output is pretty solid against the vast majority of targets in 40k, anything that's either -1 damage or toughness 8 or more units is really going to shrug off that plasma fire a lot better. You're probably better off having at least a few units that are going to be good at busting heavy armor, things like Melter Eradicators perhaps. At least in theory world though, I can see why a lot of people think that these guys look pretty intimidating. If you just decided to dump a fair amount of your points into them, then 3 squads of 6 of these would come to 720 points now. That gets you 18 Gravis bodies on the field, and maybe add a jump or bike captain to get them some rerolls. It wouldn't be too hard to keep multiple squads in range of him. That little death ball would put out around about 72 plasma shots on average, going up to a crazy 108 against units that have got more than 5 models in them. Enemy hordes really wouldn't like to be seeing that on the table. If you did get yourself an alpha strike against something that's a reasonably optimal target, that kills something like 39 dead Space Marines, 15 dead Terminators, or 60 wounds to toughness 7 vehicles, some really quite chunky numbers for an alpha strike there, and this is completely in absence of anything like the tactical doctrine buff, chapter buffs that you might have, other characters that might be supporting them, or any stratagems that you might have like weapons from the Dark Age. Overall, looking fairly scary. I wouldn't be too surprised if a fair few Space Marine lists decide to start running them. If Space Marines become a big part of the meta, I guess they're quite a good counter Space Marine type unit. Let me know your thoughts though. How scary are the Inceptors looking on paper, and would you be worried about facing a significant amount of them in the enemy army? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, while I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. If you'd like something else to watch about the new Space Marines with the points updates, I'll link my big Space Marine analysis video down in the video description, where we go through all the points changes and what's looking better. Finally, if you have been enjoying the content on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and that's how I can keep so many videos coming like this quite so regularly. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.